First contact and betrayal. The skies above New Washington burned. Massive ships, their hulls gleaming with an otherworldly sheen, hung in low orbit like malevolent stars. On the streets below, chaos reigned. Sirens wailed as civilians fled in terror, their screams punctuating the rhythmic thump of alien weaponry. Amidst the pandemonium, Captain Sarah Chen of the United Earth Defense Force crouched behind the twisted wreckage of what had once been a hover car. Her dark eyes scanned the rubble-strewn street, alert for any sign of movement. The acrid stench of ozone and burning plastics filled her nostrils, a grim reminder of how quickly their world had changed. Just 3 days ago, humanity had celebrated first contact. The Zarki, as they called themselves, had arrived in a dazzling display of technological prowess, their sleek vessels dwarfing anything Earth had ever produced. They came bearing gifts, cures for diseases, clean energy solutions, and promises of a brighter future among the stars. Sarah had been there, standing proud in her dress uniform as Earth's leaders welcomed the alien delegation. She remembered the sense of awe and hope that had filled her chest as she watched the Zarki ambassador, a tall, ethereal being with iridescent skin and eyes like liquid silver, address the United Nations. "We come in peace," the alien had said, its melodious voice translated through advanced technology, "to usher in a new era of prosperity for both our peoples." How naive they had been, how eagerly they had embraced these visitors from the stars, blind to the danger that lurked beneath their benevolent facade. A muffled whimper snapped Sarah back to the present. She turned to see Private Miguel Ramirez, barely more than a kid, clutching his rifle with white-knuckled hands. His olive skin was pale beneath a layer of grime and sweat. "Steady, Ramirez," Sarah whispered, reaching out to grip the young soldier's shoulder. "We're going to make it through this." Miguel nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, ma'am. It's just my family. They're out there somewhere." Sarah felt a pang of guilt. Her own parents were safe, she hoped, in one of the underground bunkers. But so many others hadn't been so lucky. The Zarki attack had come swiftly and without warning, targeting major population centers across the globe. "We'll find them," Sarah promised, though she knew it might be a lie. "But right now, we need to focus on our mission." "Understood." "Yes, Captain," Miguel replied, his voice steadier now. Sarah checked her wrist-mounted computer, grimacing at the display. Communications were still down across most of the city, but they'd managed to establish a secure link with what remained of UEDF command. Their orders were clear: make their way to the old subway tunnels beneath the city. A resistance was forming, and every able-bodied soldier was needed. "All right, let's move," Sarah ordered, motioning for Miguel to follow. They darted from cover to cover, using the scattered debris as concealment. The distant sound of weapons fire echoed through the concrete canyons of the city, punctuated by the occasional earth-shaking boom of orbital bombardment. As they rounded a corner, Sarah froze. A Zarki patrol stood less than 50 meters away, their tall, spindly forms a stark contrast to the human architecture around them. The aliens moved with an unsettling grace, their forearms manipulating strange devices that pulsed with an eerie blue light. Sarah signaled for Miguel to stay low, her mind racing. They couldn't risk a firefight, not when they were so badly outgunned. But the patrol stood between them and their destination. Suddenly, a figure burst from a nearby building, sprinting toward the aliens. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat as she recognized the tattered remains of a UEDF uniform. Before she could shout a warning, the Zarki opened fire. Beams of coherent light lashed out, and the running figure crumpled mid-stride. In that moment of distraction, Sarah made her decision. "Now," she hissed, bursting from cover. Miguel followed, and together they ran, keeping low and praying the aliens wouldn't notice them. They'd almost made it when Miguel's foot caught on a piece of debris. He stumbled, the clatter of his rifle against the pavement impossibly loud in the tense silence. The Zarki turned as one, their silvery eyes locking onto the two humans. Sarah didn't hesitate. "Run," she shouted, bringing her own weapon to bear. She squeezed the trigger, sending a burst of plasma toward the aliens. To her shock, the energy bolt splashed harmlessly against some kind of invisible barrier surrounding the Zaki. One of the aliens raised its weapon, the air around it shimmering with heat. Sarah Dove, feeling the searing passage of an energy beam just above her head, she rolled, came up firing, more to keep the aliens' heads down than out of any hope of harming them. "This way," Miguel called. He'd found a partially collapsed storefront, its interior dark and promising shelter. Sarah backpedaled, laying down cover and fire as she retreated. They crashed through the broken window, glass crunching beneath their boots. Sarah's lungs burned as she gulped in air, the adrenaline surge leaving her trembling. "You okay?" she asked Miguel between breaths. He nodded, eyes wide. "Yeah, that was too close." Sarah was about to reply when a soft whirring sound caught her attention. She whirled, weapon raised, to see a small drone hovering near the ceiling. Its single lens focused on them, a red light blinking steadily. "Shit," Sarah muttered. She took aim, but before she could fire, the drone emitted a piercing shriek. The sound cut through her skull like a knife, and Sarah dropped to her knees, hands clasped over her ears. Through watering eyes, she saw Miguel similarly incapacitated. The world seemed to tilt and spin around her as the noise bored into her brain. Just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, blessed silence fell. Sarah struggled to her feet, fighting waves of nausea. She stumbled to Miguel's side, holding him upright. "We have to move," she said, her own voice sounding distant and muffled. They staggered deeper into the building, navigating through cluttered aisles and toppled shelves. In the back, Sarah found what she was looking for, a heavy door marked "Employees Only." Beyond it lay a stairwell leading down. "The tunnels," she said, a spark of hope flickering in her chest. "We can still make it." They descended into darkness, the sounds of pursuit fading behind them. The air grew cooler, tinged with the musty scent of long-abandoned spaces. Sarah's wrist computer provided meager illumination, barely enough to avoid tripping on the uneven steps. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the bottom. A long corridor stretched before them, disappearing into blackness. Sarah consulted her map, orienting herself. "This way," she said, pointing. "It should lead us to one of the old stations. From there we can." A thunderous boom cut her off, the entire tunnel shaking with the impact. Dust and small chunks of concrete rained down from the ceiling. "They're bombing the tunnels," Miguel said, his voice tight with fear. Sarah nodded grimly. "They must know we're using them. Come on, we need to hurry." They set off at a jog, the rhythmic impacts of explosions above driving them forward. Sarah's mind raced, trying to calculate their chances. If the Zarki collapsed the tunnels, they'd be trapped down here, buried alive in the dark. Another explosion, closer this time. The tunnel groaned ominously, hairline cracks spider webbing across the ceiling. "Look," Miguel shouted, pointing ahead. A faint glow illuminated the end of the passage. They sprinted toward it, legs burning with the effort. As they drew closer, Sarah could make out figures moving in the light. Human figures. "Hold it right there," a gruff voice commanded. Sarah and Miguel skidded to a halt, raising their hands instinctively. A group of armed civilians had taken up defensive positions around the tunnel entrance, their weapons trained on the newcomers. "Captain Sarah Chen, United Earth Defense Force," Sarah called out, slowly reaching for her ID. "We're here on orders from command." A tall man with a salt and pepper beard stepped forward, scrutinizing them. After a moment, he nodded to his companions. "Lower your weapons. They're friendlies." As the civilians relaxed, Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. They'd made it. Against all odds, they'd reached the resistance. The bearded man approached, extending his hand. "Colonel James Harper, retired. Welcome to the last bastion of free humanity, Captain." Sarah shook his hand, taking in the makeshift command center behind him. Banks of salvaged computers hummed, their screens displaying a patchwork of surveillance feeds and tactical data. Men and women of all ages moved with purpose, some in military uniforms, others in civilian clothes. "Glad to be here, sir," Sarah replied. "What's our status?" Harper's expression darkened. "Not good. We've lost contact with most major cities. The Zaki have air and orbital superiority. Ground forces are being overrun everywhere we look." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Is there any good news?" Harper managed a grim smile. "Just one thing. We think we found a weakness in their defenses. Come with me. There's someone you need to meet." He led Sarah and Miguel deeper into the station, past rows of cots where exhausted fighters snatched moments of rest. In a small side room, a figure hunched over a cluttered workbench, muttering to itself. "Dr. Amelia Novak," Harper said by way of introduction. "The best xenobiologist we've got left." The woman turned, pushing a pair of magnifying goggles up onto her forehead. Her eyes lit up at the sight of the newcomers. "Ah, excellent. More test subjects." Sarah exchanged a worried glance with Miguel. "Test subjects." Dr. Novak waved a hand dismissively. "Nothing invasive, I assure you. I just need blood samples. You see, I've made a fascinating discovery about our alien friends." She gestured to a complex apparatus on her workbench. Within a sealed chamber, a piece of technology pulsed with that same eerie blue light Sarah had seen earlier. "Their entire technological base," Dr. Novak explained, her voice brimming with excitement, "is built on a foundation of organic components, living technology intertwined with their own biology." Sarah leaned in, studying the alien device. Now that she looked closely, she could see that parts of it seemed to twitch and move of their own accord. "That's why our weapons are ineffective," Dr. Novak continued. "Their defenses are adaptive, almost like an immune system. But every immune system has its vulnerabilities, and I think I've found theirs." Hope, fragile but undeniable, began to bloom in Sarah's chest. She met Dr. Novak's gaze, seeing the same determination reflected there. "Tell me everything," Sarah said. As Dr. Novak launched into her explanation, Sarah allowed herself a moment of quiet resolve. They had made a grave mistake in underestimating humanity. And now, in these dark tunnels beneath a burning world, the seeds of resistance were taking root. The fight for Earth had only just. The flickering light of salvaged plasma lamps cast long shadows across the makeshift war room. Captain Sarah Chen stood before a battered, its display showing a sea of red that represented Zaki-controlled territory. The small pockets of blue, signifying human resistance, seemed painfully small in comparison. "We're losing ground every day," Colonel Harper said, his voice gruff with fatigue. "But thanks to Dr. Novak's discovery, we might just have a fighting chance." Sarah nodded, her mind racing with the implications of what they had shared. The organic technology, while incredibly advanced, had a critical weakness. It was susceptible to certain human pathogens. Specifically, a strain of bacteria commonly found in human gut flora seemed to have a devastating effect on their systems. "How soon can we weaponize this?" Sarah asked, turning to Dr. Novak. The scientist pushed her goggles up, revealing dark circles under her eyes. "I synthesized a concentrated form of the bacteria. We can start production immediately, but delivery is the real challenge. We need to find a way to disperse it effectively against their shields." Private Miguel Ramirez, who had been quietly observing until now, spoke up. "What about their water supply? If we could introduce it there?" Sarah shook her head. "The Zaki don't need water like we do. Their biology is completely alien." "Air filtration systems," a new voice suggested. Sarah turned to see a tall, lanky man with unkempt hair and a patchy beard step forward. "Sorry, I couldn't help overhearing. Name's Jake Reeves. I was working on atmospheric processors before all this." Colonel Harper gestured for Jake to continue. The engineer cleared his throat nervously. "The Zaki ships and ground bases all have extensive air filtration. It's how they maintain their preferred atmosphere. If we could introduce Dr. Novak's bacteria into those systems. A spark of excitement lit up Sarah's eyes. We could infect entire installations at once. Jake, you're a genius. Don't celebrate yet, Dr. Novak cautioned. We still need to get close enough to their facilities to introduce the pathogen, and we have no idea how long it will take to affect their systems once dispersed. Sarah turned back to the holotable, her mind already formulating a plan. We'll need a diversion, something big enough to draw their attention while a small team infiltrates their primary atmospheric control center. Colonel Harper stroked his beard thoughtfully. I might have just the thing. We've been stockpiling old thermobaric weapons. If we detonate them in a coordinated strike, it could look like we're launching a major offensive. That could work, Sarah agreed. But we'll need volunteers for the infiltration team. It's likely to be a one-way trip. A heady silence fell over the room. The risks were enormous, but the stakes were even higher. Humanity's very existence hung in the balance. To Sarah's surprise, it was Miguel who stepped forward first. I'll go, Captain, for my family and for Earth. Pride swelled in Sarah's chest. The young private had come a long way from the terrified soldier she first encountered in the ruins of New Washington. Thank you, Miguel. I'll be leading the team personally. One by one, others volunteered. Jake Reeves offered his expertise in atmospheric systems. A grizzled ex-Marine named Sergeant Anna Kovac stepped up, her cybernetic arm whirring softly as she saluted. Dr. Novak insisted on coming along to ensure the proper dispersal of her pathogen. As the team assembled, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. It was a desperate plan, born of desperation, but it was the best chance they had. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah drilled her team relentlessly, running simulations of the infiltration based on what little intel they had on Zaki installations. Dr. Novak worked tirelessly to produce enough of her weaponized bacteria, her lab a hive of activity. On the eve of the mission, Sarah found herself unable to sleep. She wandered the tunnels, eventually finding her way to a small alcove that had been converted into a makeshift memorial. Hundreds of photos lined the walls, faces of the lost and missing staring back at her. Sarah's throat tightened as she scanned the images, recognizing some from her own unit. Trouble sleeping, Captain? Sarah turned to see Colonel Harper approaching, a steaming mug in his hand. He offered it to her, and she accepted gratefully, inhaling the aroma of real coffee, a rare luxury these days. Just thinking about tomorrow, Sarah admitted, about what we're risking and what it means if we fail. Harper nodded sullenly. I've let men and women into battle more times than I care to remember. It never gets easier, knowing you're sending good people to their potential deaths. How do you deal with it? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. You remember what you're fighting for, Harper replied, gesturing to the wall of photos. You remember that every life lost in this war is on the Zaki's hands, not yours, and you do everything in your power to make sure those sacrifices aren't in vain. Sarah sipped her coffee, letting the warmth spread through her. Thank you, sir. I needed to hear that. As dawn broke, or what passed for dawn in the eternal twilight of the underground, Sarah gathered her team for a final briefing. The plan was simple in theory, but fraught with danger at every turn. The diversionary attack would begin at 800, with resistance cells across the region launching coordinated strikes against Zaki patrols and smaller outposts. At 8:30, the thermobaric weapons would be detonated, creating the illusion of a major human offensive. In the chaos that followed, Sarah's team would approach the primary atmospheric control center under cover of the massive dust clouds kicked up by the explosions. They would have a narrow window to infiltrate the facility, locate the central air filtration system, and introduce Dr. Novak's pathogen. Remember, Sarah said, meeting each team member's eyes in turn, our success here could turn the tide of the entire war. But even if we fail, we'll have shown the Zaki that humanity will never stop fighting. Are there any questions? Silence greeted her words, each face set with grim determination. "Then let's move out," Sarah ordered. "For Earth." "For Earth," the team echoed. They made their way through the tunnels to a concealed exit point, emerging into a landscape that still had the power to shock Sarah, no matter how many times she'd seen it. The once proud skyline of New Washington was a jagged ruin, many of its towering skyscrapers reduced to twisted metal and shattered concrete. In the distance, Zaki ships hung in the sky like malevolent stars. As they moved through the ruins, Sarah's wrist computer chirped softly. A message scrolled across its screen: "Diversionary attacks commencing. Good luck and Godspeed." Right on schedule, the horizon lit up with dozens of explosions. Alarms began to wail across the Zaki-controlled zones, and Sarah saw enemy ships begin to move, responding to the perceived threat. 30 minutes to thermobaric detonation," Sarah murmured. "Double time, people. We need to be in position." They pushed forward, using the cover of ruined buildings to mask their approach. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, every sense hyper-alert for signs of enemy patrols. But the Zaki seemed fully occupied with the diversionary attacks, their forces scrambling to respond to threats from multiple directions. As they neared the atmospheric control center, a massive alien structure that dominated the skyline, Sarah checked her watch. 2 minutes to detonation. Everyone, brace yourselves. The team took cover behind a collapsed wall, and Sarah began a silent countdown. 3, 2, 1. The world exploded. Even at this distance, the force of the thermobaric explosions was staggering. A wall of heat and pressure rolled over them, followed by a thunderous roar that Sarah felt in her bones. Dust and debris filled the air, reducing visibility to near zero. "Move!" Sarah shouted over the ringing in her ears. "This is our chance." They sprinted towards the Zaki facility, using the chaos and poor visibility to their advantage. As they approached the outer perimeter, Jake pulled out a device he'd cobbled together from salvaged Zaki tech. "This should get us through their security field," he said, his voice tense with concentration. He activated the device, and Sarah felt a strange tingling sensation as they passed through the normally impenetrable barrier. Inside the perimeter, the alien nature of the facility became even more apparent. The walls seemed to pulse with an inner light, and Sarah could have sworn she saw parts of the structure move and shift of their own accord. "Which way to the central air filtration?" Sarah asked, fighting down a wave of disorientation. Jake consulted his improvised scanner. 2 levels down, about 200 meters east of our position. They moved swiftly, encountering surprisingly little resistance. Most of the Zaki forces seemed to have been drawn away by the diversionary attacks. Those they did encounter were quickly and silently neutralized by Sergeant Kovac, her cybernetic arm proving devastatingly effective in close-quarters combat. As they descended deeper into the facility, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was all too easy. Her instincts, honed by years of combat, screamed that something was wrong. Those instincts proved correct as they rounded a corner and came face to face with a squad of Zaki warriors. For a heartbeat, both sides froze in mutual surprise. Then all hell broke loose. Energy weapons flared, filling the corridor with searing light. Sarah dove for cover, returning fire with her plasma rifle. She saw Miguel go down, a glancing hit to his shoulder spinning him around. "Kovac, get Miguel clear," Sarah shouted. "Jake, Dr. Novak, keep moving to the objective. We'll hold them here." The battle was chaotic and brutally close quarters. Sarah had never fought the Zaki at such close range before, and their alien physiology made their movements unpredictable. She watched in horror as one of the creatures seemed to dislocate its joints, contorting its body to squeeze through a gap no human could have managed. A searing pain lanced through Sarah's leg as an energy blast caught her. She stumbled, nearly dropping her weapon. Through gritted teeth, she kept firing, determined to buy Jake and Dr. Novak the time they needed. Just when it seemed they would be overwhelmed, a familiar voice crackled over Sarah's comm unit. "Captain Chen, do you copy?" This is Colonel Harper. We're picking up massive energy fluctuations from your position. What's your status? Sarah ducked behind a twisted piece of alien machinery, taking a moment to respond. We've breached the facility, but we're pinned down. 2 team members are proceeding to the objective. Understood, Harper replied. We're seeing some strange readings from orbit. The Zaki fleet is, Captain, you need to hurry. Something big is happening. As if in response to Harper's words, the entire structure shuddered. Alarms began to wail, their alien tones setting Sarah's teeth on edge. The Zaki warriors broke off their attack, retreating deeper into the facility. Jake, report. Sarah barked into her comm. What's your status? Static crackled for a moment before Jake's voice came through, breathless and excited. We made it, Captain. Dr. Novak is introducing the pathogen now. But you need to see this. The whole place is going crazy. It's like the building itself is alive, and it knows something's wrong. Sarah helped Miguel to his feet, supporting him as they moved to regroup with Jake and Dr. Novak. As they descended deeper into the facility, Sarah saw what Jake meant. The walls themselves seemed to be writhing, patterns of light racing along their surface like synapses firing. They found Jake and Dr. Novak in a vast chamber dominated by what could only be the central air filtration system. It was a pulsing, organic-looking mass that filled most of the room. Dr. Novak stood before a control panel, her fingers dancing over alien interfaces. It's done, she announced as Sarah approached. I've introduced the pathogen into their system. Now we just have to hope it works as quickly as it did in my lab tests. Before Sarah could respond, the facility shook again, more violently this time. Pieces of the ceiling began to rain down around them. We need to get out of here, Sarah ordered. Move. They retraced their steps, the journey out even more harrowing than their infiltration had been. The entire structure seemed to be tearing itself apart around them. Twice, Sarah had to drag team members clear of suddenly opening chasms in the floor. As they finally burst out of the facility's main entrance, Sarah's jaw dropped at the sight that greeted them. The sky was filled with Zaki ships, far more than she'd ever seen in one place. But something was wrong. The vessels moved erratically, some colliding with each other in showers of debris. My God, Dr. Novak breathed. It's working. The pathogen must have spread through their entire network. Sarah's comm crackled to life again. Captain Chen, if you can hear me, you need to clear the area immediately. Colonel Harper's voice urged. We're detecting massive energy buildups in the Zaki ships. They're going tow. His words were cut off as the sky exploded into light. Sarah threw herself over Miguel, shielding him as best she could as a shockwave of unimaginable force rolled over them. When she dared to look up again, the scene had transformed once more. The Zaki ships were gone, reduced to falling debris that rained down on the ruined city. The massive alien structure behind them was collapsing in on itself, its otherworldly architecture crumbling like sand. As the dust began to settle, Sarah slowly got to her feet, helping Miguel up beside her. She looked at her team, battered, exhausted, but alive, and felt a surge of fierce pride. We did it, she said, her voice hoarse. We actually did it. Dr. Novak was staring at her handheld scanner, her eyes wide with disbelief. The pathogen, it's spreading exponentially through their entire network. Every Zaki ship, every base, they're all going dark. Sarah turned to survey the devastated landscape around them. The war wasn't over. There would be pockets of Zaki resistance, and the task of rebuilding would be monumental. But for the first time since the invasion began, she allowed herself to feel true hope. Humanity had been pushed to the brink of extinction. They'd faced an enemy with technology so advanced it seemed like magic. And yet, in the end, it was human ingenuity, human determination, and human biology itself that had turned the tide. Sarah Chen looked at her team, then up at the sky, no longer dominated by alien ships, but open and full of promise. Let's go home, she said. We've got a world to rebuild. As they began the long trek back to the resistance base, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. The Zaki had made a fatal mistake in underestimating humanity. They'd learned the hard way that when pushed to the edge, humans didn't just survive, they came back stronger than ever. The dawn of a new era was breaking over Earth, and humanity would face it united, tempered by fire, and ready for whatever the universe might throw at them next.